Well, good morning and welcome to Sunday School. We are finishing up the book of Daniel next week, so we only have 2 more lessons in the book of Daniel. I've enjoyed studying it, and so thank you for joining me in this endeavor. And so as we begin today, we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7, and it's going to be one of the 4 visions that Daniel had near the end of the book. But today we're going to be starting off by asking a question. The question is, what did you learn from history? Did you enjoy learning history? What are some of the lessons that you remember growing up and the history lessons and whatnot? Because history is pretty important. You may have heard the phrase, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it, or maybe a version of that statement. And it's pretty true. It's pretty important. We can look back to history and learn a lot of things. And so this vision in Daniel chapter 7 that we're going to look at of the 4 beasts, this vision was something for the future for Daniel. God was revealing something about the future to Daniel, yet we look at it and most of this vision is in the past, and so we look at it as history. So either way, whether Daniel looking forward or us believers looking back, we're going to learn the same message, and that is believers can live with confidence knowing that God's kingdom will last forever. It is eternal. And that's really encouraging. It was definitely troubling. The vision was troubling to Daniel, but the message is very much encouraging because we know that God is in control. So that's what we're going to look at. Real quick, the context of chapter 7. I've kind of already mentioned that there were 4 visions that Daniel had near the end. So chapter 7 through 12 records those visions that Daniel had. And all of these visions highlight God's sovereignty, his control, his power, his might, his sovereignty over all the nations and the kingdoms. And it emphasizes how God is the victor. He is the one who is going to win. And his people can trust in him. We as believers can trust in him. And so the specific message that we're going to look at today is from the first vision in chapter 7. When you get a chance, I would strongly encourage you to read all of Daniel chapter 7. Today we're going to be focusing on the first 14 verses. I'll mention some of the rest of the chapter. But the second half of this chapter provides the interpretation. So if you want to dive in a little bit further, see a little bit more, I would encourage you to read the whole chapter because it shows that these 4 beasts may rule for a time. They may fight against the Most High. They may fight against God, but God is sovereign. And he is going to reign forever, passing judgment on these kings. So I know that's getting a little bit ahead, telling the end of the story before we even dive in. But I would encourage you to read the entire chapter of Daniel chapter 7. And so that's what we're going to look at. Daniel chapter 7, looking at verses 1 through 6. And before I read those verses real quick, I do want to ask this question. It's kind of continuing the theme of school. And who likes poetry? Are you someone who is a fan of poetry? I know I didn't do very well in college with English lit and all this other stuff, and it wasn't my favorite class. Let's just leave it at that. But what are some of the characteristics of poetry? What are some aspects of poetry? You're probably listing off several of them. I had to look them up. But the one I want to focus on is figurative language. This use of language to describe something. And so it's close, but it's not exactly. It's describing characteristics using figurative language. And the reason I bring that up is because we're about to read verses 1 through 6. And there's some words such as like. He's going to describe these beasts and use the word like. It looked like this. And so this figurative language is very important for us to understand because Daniel is using language. He's using language to describe these visions in a way that people could understand them, using language that others could understand. And so we need to understand that. We need to realize that and know what he's doing here. And so that's what we're going to read, verses 1 through 6 right here. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon. Just real quick, chapter 5, we talked a little bit about the fact that Belshazzar did not learn the lesson from King Nebuchadnezzar's pride. He didn't learn it. And so King Belshazzar made the same mistake and he suffered the same judgment. And so that was in chapter 5. This vision right here in chapter 7 came before chapter 5, but it's recorded back here. So in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream with visions in his mind. as he was lying in his bed. He wrote down the dream, and here is the summary of his account. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I was watching, and suddenly the four winds of heaven stirred up the great sea. 4 huge beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted up from the ground, set on its feet like a man, and given a human mind. Suddenly, another beast appeared, a second one, that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up, gorge yourself on flesh.' After this, while I was watching, suddenly another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. It had 4 heads and was given dominion." So these first 6 verses lay out the 3 beasts. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, look at a few details, but then ask a question. And so, like I said, this is the first year of King Belshazzar. Daniel had a dream. And if you remember back in chapter 2, Daniel was gifted by God. God gifted Daniel with the ability to interpret dreams. And so we see him do that in chapter 2. And so another thing that I want to point out before we move on is that this isn't the full dream. This isn't the full record of the dream. In verse 1 it says, this is a summary of his account. So these are just the key details. It's not the full thing. And so we just need to understand that. And we're getting a little bits and pictures of it, but it's the message of God being sovereign, God being in control, that is important here. And so now we're going to move on and look at the specific 3 beasts. So first of all, the 4 winds. Verse 2 it says, "In my vision at night I was watching, and suddenly the 4 winds of heaven stirred up." This has come up before in Daniel, other passages of Daniel. It's come up in Ezekiel. It comes up in Matthew and Revelation. And every time it is stressing the sovereignty of God, because he controls the force of nature and he works throughout history. And so that's the picture that is being painted here, that God is about to do a mighty work. God is bringing this about in his vision. The great sea here, looking at verse number 2, continuing, "The 4 winds of heaven stirred up the great sea." Likely, the great sea is referring to the Mediterranean Sea. That would have been the sea that Daniel would have been most familiar with. That's likely what it's talking about. But probably what it's referring to is this is just pointing out the stirring of God's purpose. God is revealing something to Daniel. And so this just, something's about to happen, so to speak. And so the first beast comes in verse number 3. Verse number 4. 4 huge beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted up from the ground, set on its feet like a man, and given human mind. All right, so this first beast was like a lion. That's that word there, like. It's similar to a lion. But lions don't stand on 2 feet. It doesn't stand up from the ground, set on feet like a man. So there's some differences. Essentially, Daniel is trying to convey as close as possible some of the characteristics of it. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting, and as we're going to go through each of these, we'll see this, there are people who have given this a lot of thought, and there are individuals who they believe and they see that this lion is meaning to represent the kingdom of Babylon, and specifically King Nebuchadnezzar. And so I think this is kind of cool, and it's kind of interesting to look at. And one of the things that you remember is, what was King Nebuchadnezzar? He was made to look like an animal and to eat on the grounds. But then he was raised up, he was restored, and his mind returned to him. And so this picture does connect pretty well with Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4, 28 through 37, where King Nebuchadnezzar was humbled. And so the kingdom of Babylon was very mighty and great. And so this is the imagery that is being mentioned. And so this is the interpretation that we typically see, that this was pointing to the kingdom of Babylon. One thing that's interesting is we see that the wings were torn off. So the wings were torn off. It's kind of a clipping of the wings. It's a restraint of the power. And so Babylon was very mighty and very much powerful, yet it looks like the wings were torn off and the power and the influence of the king was limited. And so this does also apply in this case. And so we see here the first beast. Then we're going to move on to the second beast in chapter 7, verse 5. Suddenly another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth. Between its teeth, it was told, "Get up, gorge yourself on flesh." Before we dive into some specifics and whatnot, we see this being a very ferocious picture. We see a bear of power and might eating, gorging on and eating, and on having 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. We see this picture as being very much ferocious, and the belief is that this is pointing to Persia, pointing to Persia or Medo-Persia. I'm not sure all of the details, but I was just reading this. It was kind of interesting that Medo-Persia is often referred to as just Persia, because Persia was the driving force in that kingdom, in that empire, so to speak. And so it's raised up on one side. One side is more powerful than the other. And so Persia was that dominant part. Furthermore, Persia conquered, so 3 of the main nations that were conquered by Persia, or kingdoms that were conquered, was Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. And so in history, we look back to it and we see that those 3 ribs in the mouth were likely referring to that. And so we see the connection there. It was a mighty bear. It was told to get up and gorge itself. And so we see just a ferocious kingdom progressing. Verse 6 comes up, and now we have another one. So verse 6, we see a third beast. And it comes up and it says, "After this, while I was watching, suddenly another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. It had 4 heads, and it was given dominion." Some commentaries were talking about the leopard, how it was just such a fast animal. The 4 wings and the 4 heads, talking about this. And so the belief is that this beast represents Alexander the Great in his conquest and his establishment of the Greek Empire. Because he did it by the age he was 33, he did it very quickly. And after his death, his 4 generals divided his empire. And so we see some connections there. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a second, but really quick, I want to ask this question. We've read this, we've looked at it, we've done some interpretation, but what do you think was going through Daniel's mind when he saw this vision? Excuse me. What do you think was going through Daniel's mind as he saw this vision? I don't know. I don't know what I would be thinking. Fortunately, we have the ability to look a little bit later and see what Daniel was thinking. So look at verse 15. We'll come back in just a second. But looking at verse 15 in chapter 7, it says, "As for me, Daniel, my spirit was deeply distressed within me, and the visions in my mind terrified me." There was some concern with Daniel. He didn't know exactly what to do with it. The rest of the chapter goes on and he gets an interpretation, but this caused him some great distress in his heart. And we can understand that. And so I began this lesson by talking about history, looking back on it. And so if Daniel's visions are referring to Babylon, Persia, and the Greek Empire, how should we as believers understand the verses we just read? We have the benefit of looking back on these events and looking at the historical surroundings of these kingdoms, and these are kingdoms. In I think it's verse number 18 or 19, it talks about them that they were going to be kings, that they represent kings. Verse 17, it says, "These huge beasts, 4 in number, are 4 kings who will rise from the earth." So from the biblical message, we see these are kingdoms. And so what do we learn from this by looking back on history? I would say there's a lot of things to think about, but ultimately we see that God rules over all the kingdoms. And God is relaying this information to Daniel, telling him the future, what is to come. And we are looking back on the past and saying, these mighty beasts that gave Daniel a great scare and caused him distress and concern, and he didn't know what was going on. Those kingdoms, they are no longer. They do not rule. Babylon was defeated by Persia. Persia was defeated by the Greek Empire, and then we're going to see later Rome came in and was greater than all of them. And so we should learn that God is in control. No matter how bad it might get, God is in control, and His kingdom lasts forever. And that's really the message. That's the point of this vision for Daniel. It's to let him know who is in control. God is in control. And so if we as believers truly believe it, if we truly believe that God is in control over the kingdoms, how should this impact our lives? We can talk about history, we can look back to Daniel's time, but now, how does it impact our lives here and now? And we'll get into some more application a little bit later, but trust God and live for Him no matter the circumstances. That's the thing that Daniel did throughout his life, and that's the message that we need to receive, is that God is trustworthy and we can live for Him. We can pursue Him. He is in control. So those are the first three beasts, and I probably took a little bit too much time on that, but now we're going to look at the fourth beast, verses 7 through 8. The fourth beast and the horn. And so let's read those verses 7 through 8. After this, while I was watching in the night visions, suddenly a fourth beast appeared, frightening and dreadful and incredibly strong, with large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed, and it trampled with its feet whatever was left. It was different from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. Verse 8, while I was considering the horns, suddenly another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. And suddenly in his horn there were eyes like the eyes of a human, and a mouth that was speaking arrogantly. So these two verses are introducing this fourth beast. And something I want to point out for us is that notice that it was different from all the beasts before it. Daniel wasn't able to describe it using something that he had seen before. It was just so different, so outside of that. He used some words we understand. He used some words such as frightening, dreadful, incredibly strong, large iron teeth, devouring. And so he described something that was very much fierce. And he described the large iron teeth, painting the picture of a kingdom that would devour everything around it. Just the ferocity of this kingdom. And so it was different, it was mightier, and it was very much a threat in this vision. And so we see the 10 horns. It's kind of interesting. 10 horns often horns refer to might and power and things like that. And so the belief is that these 10 horns represent the 10 main Roman emperors of Rome. And so this fourth kingdom is likely representing Rome, the Roman Empire, and the 10 emperors of that empire. And so that's the picture that's being painted. Yet there comes a fourth horn, 11th horn, a little one that comes up and grows up. Many scholars see this little horn as the Antichrist. And so if we see that, and the description here of what it was doing, the way it was mocking and just bragging, its arrogance, so to speak, it matches what we know of coming in Revelation 13 and 1 Thessalonians 2. We see this picture of the Antichrist raising his voice against God and the people of God. And so that matches in this description. There's a lot of information, a lot of background information. But as we look at this, I kind of want to remind us of some other things we've seen in the book of Daniel. So as we read this, we see this mighty beast, this ferocious beast that's devouring everything, the threat, the fear, the dread that comes from it. And so I want to ask this question. Having read the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how do you think they would have responded to the threat of this fourth beast? How do you think they would have responded? We don't know this. This is just us thinking about it. But I can say very clearly that they would have had the stance of, God can rescue us from this situation, from this beast, but even if he doesn't, we're going to stand firm and worship God alone. Even if he doesn't rescue us, he can, but even if he doesn't, we're going to stand firm. And so this vision, as terrifying as it is, it does point us back. And we're going to learn in just a minute. It reminds us of who we trust in. Not ourselves, not in our kingdoms, our nations. We trust in God alone because he is sovereign. He is in control. He is everlasting. And he is our Savior. So this picture is pretty bleak. And I would say this, if we stopped right there, I'm sure Daniel would have probably tried not to sleep ever again because he wouldn't want to have this dream again. But look at verse number 9, and see what he saw. Verse 9 says, "As I kept watching, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white like snow, and the hair of his head like whitest wool. His throne was flaming fire, its wheels were blazing fire. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was convened and the books were opened." We're going to dive into the rest in just a minute. But as we look at that, I just want you to think about the fact that fortunately the vision didn't stop there for Daniel. He was going to see that God was going to come in his might and his judgment. And so I would say this is very, very much a contrast. And so we see God introduced as the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days. And interestingly, that title is only referred to here in Daniel. It's used 3 times, but it's only in Daniel chapter 7. But what does it convey? It conveys that God is sovereign over everything. There's some other passages in the Bible. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 talks about the fact that God is the eternal Father. But why is this important? Why is it important in this passage to see that God is referred to as the Ancient of Days? How does that title contrast with the 4 beasts or the kingdoms that came before? And really, it contrasts because God is the one who is over all eternity. But remember, these beasts, specifically the 4th one, is going to come and devour these other kingdoms. These kingdoms may be big and bad and mighty, and they might even try to challenge God, but when it comes down to it, they have no authority. God is the one between with the power and the might. He's the one who lasts forever. His kingdom lasts forever. And so these verses very much contrast between the arrogance and the loudmouth arrogance of Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, and the display of order and authority in these verses. God isn't worried about the threat because he's in charge, and we're going to see him deliver judgment. So this is an encouraging shift in the vision, one that we need to take attention to and see it and understand what's going on. We also see here that God, this Ancient of Days, was clothed with white like snow. This is often used to denote purity or holiness. And so we see that God is holy and he's pure. It says that his hair was like whitest wool. This is probably demonstrating God's his great age and wisdom. We see that his judgment is the fire. The throne was a flaming fire, a blazing fire. So it's likely God's judgment and his wrath, or the fact that it's a purifying fire. Anything that comes in contact with it is purified. Either way, what we see in this passage is pretty clear. It's this idea of God in charge. He is on the throne. He is the one who is mighty and just and righteous. And he is the one who is served by thousands and thousands, his might and his power. And so in this vision, we see this, but it kind of reminds me of King Nebuchadnezzar's experience in Daniel chapter 4. So when we looked at King Nebuchadnezzar's experience in chapter 4, how does that compare to this passage here? Well, I'm not going to read it, but if you want to, I would encourage you to read verses 34 and 30 through 37 in chapter 4. That's the experience of King Nebuchadnezzar's humbling. And what happened here is that Nebuchadnezzar, he learned the hard way that if you play with fire, you're going to get burnt. Meaning if you try God, if you have pride in your life and you worship yourself, you promote yourself, you boast in yourself, you're going to be humbled. That's what God did to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar also thought that he was very mighty and he was powerful, but he clearly learned that God is infinitely superior in every way. He learned that he was judged, and he was rightly judged. One of the things he said is that even though in his judgment, he said God's ways are true and God's ways are just. And so we see this picture here, very similar. We see God laying out judgment, passing out judgment, rightfully so, in justice, not in hurried and concern, but in very clear demonstration of power and might. And so this comparison, this similarities, is pretty helpful, because the entire book of Daniel has been all about the fact that in the midst of difficulty, believers can trust in God because God is in control. Believers can trust in God because He is in control. Verses 11 through 14, I'm going to read through it real quick, but I want you to be thinking, how is this vision, the verses 1 through 14, as I read this, how is this vision both a warning but also encouragement? How is this a warning and an encouragement? Verse 11, I watched then because of the sound of the arrogant words the horn was speaking. As I continued watching, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was removed, but an extension of life was granted to them for a certain period of time. I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one, like a son of man, was coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. So I kind of asked the question about the warning and a vision and an encouragement. How is this vision a warning and an encouragement? And I think it's very clear. It's a warning because it warns those who oppose God that God is going to pass judgment on arrogance and pride. No matter how mighty they think they are, no matter how many accomplishments they made, if they reject God and they promote themselves, God is going to be the victor. So it's a warning in that regard. But it's also an encouragement to the people of God because it demonstrates that God's judgment will come on the world and He will deliver those who are in Him. It's an encouragement that His kingdom will last forever. It's everlasting. He will have dominion over all, and it will not be destroyed. And so we see this picture being painted, and we see this important passage that Jesus points to in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, near the end of the chapter, we see Jesus quote this. And so he's standing before the high priest, and the high priest basically says, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus says, "You have said it." And then he goes on and he quotes this passage here. He quotes about the fact that there was one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. And Jesus quotes these verses, and they recognized what Jesus was saying. He was claiming to be the Messiah. He was claiming to be the Ancient of Days. He was claiming to be God. And so they wanted to kill him. And so this passage, while it is disconcerting, distressful, fearful, frightening for Daniel, it also contains a message of hope. And if you look at the end of the chapter, Daniel is still a little unsure of what to do. He said in verse 28, "My thoughts terrified me greatly and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself." So he wrote it down, but he really didn't tell anybody. He didn't know what was going to happen. I think it's cool that this message for Daniel is a message that it applies for us. And it's an encouragement and to us, because we look back and we see the fulfillment of this vision and the continuing victory of God and His might. And so really, what does this mean to us? I know this lesson's got a little deep, looking at some history and some very obscure details and some putting some pieces together. And really what it points to is God is in control. So how do we apply that today, though? Who in here, right? No one, it's just me, but who of you keeps track of the news? Who watches the news? When you watch the news and you see some of the major events going on in the world, for example, the Olympics, the potential war in Ukraine, protests against government mandates. When you see these things going on, and many other things as well, how do we as Christians respond? How should today's lesson inform the way we view everything going on around us? And I think it really boils down to the fact that Daniel didn't have the ability to make amazing changes in his nation. Daniel was a captive in Babylon. He was longing for deliverance. He was hoping for that. And God had been blessing him, and he had been living for God entirely. But what it points to is the fact that the world we live in is a sinful place, and there are people who fight against God. Leaders of nations can be proud and they can be arrogant, but here's the deal. No matter how bad it gets, we know who wins in the end. We can have confidence in Christ, and we can trust in Him. And so in these news events, the things that are happening, we need to remember that we need to boldly live for God no matter what. Being obedient, seeking after Him. We don't know the future. Daniel, he got this vision, and he didn't exactly know how to apply it. We've got the ability to look at the past and see some of the history, but even still sometimes we're like, well, God's in control. He's sovereign. His kingdom's going to last forever, and we're just going to have to trust Him in that. And so the big picture is this. God is in control. We need to live for Him. And that's what's going on. I want to take a quick step back and say Ezekiel and Daniel, they're speaking in the midst of the context of the children of Israel being in exile in Babylon. A time of great concern and distress, and they were there for 70 years. And so I'm sure that they imagine, how can this great kingdom of Babylon be overcome? Why has God let this happen? But Daniel learned, and Daniel saw, and we can apply the fact that we can live with confidence knowing that God is in control and His kingdom will last forever. I hope you enjoyed diving into it. I hope I didn't get off on too many tangents, but that is something that we can apply. We can trust in God. So I'm going to close this in prayer. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Dear God, thank you for this message. Some of the words and the pictures and the images are weird to us. We don't think about this a whole lot, but the message is very clear. And the message you give throughout Scripture is very clear, that we can trust in you. So God, thank you for directing Daniel to write this down. Even though he didn't share it with anybody around him, thank you for the fact that it's in here, that it's painting a picture of a God who is in control, who we can trust in. So thank you, God, for what you're doing. God, I pray that for each of us, for us as believers, that we will have peace in the midst of turmoil around us. We will desire to live for you, no matter who stands against us, that your word is the word that we will follow. God, thank you for the example of Daniel, for the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the midst of all of this that's happening, that they live for you. God, I pray that we will encourage each other as we do that. Fellow believers will stand together, trusting you and abiding by your word. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.